Yi Sun-sin and Ming Naval Commander Chen Lin are on the way to the Noryang Strait. The last battle of the war is about to begin. The Allied Navy had lifted the blockade around Konishi Yukinaga's Suncheon fortress and were now at Jangdo Naval Base. From here, they would divide into two different divisions and head to Noryang. The Ming would take the northwest of the strait, while the Joseon would set up at the south of the Noryang Strait. Remember that the Japanese think that they're on the way to save Konishi. They have no idea that their enemy know about their plan and are waiting for them. At midnight, December 16th, Shimazu Yoshihiro, Tachibana Muneshige, Kobayakawa Hidekane, Takahashi Munemasa, and Tsukushi Hirokado left Cheongsong-do and were on the way to Suncheon. To get there, they would have to sail through the Noryang Strait. Shimazu Tadatsune was not with his father Yoshihiro at this time, as he was feeling sick, so he stayed behind. Yi Sun-sin's scouts alerted him of the Japanese movements. He in turn notified Chen Lin. Tachibana Muneshige's men were actually the first to spot enemy Joseon ships, as he had felt uneasy about setting sail at night and had sentries all around his fleet. At around 2 a.m. the attack began. The Japanese fleet was starting to panic, and they started to make their way to Gyeongnam-po, but then realized that it was a dead end and had to turn their ships around. Tachibana gave out the command to have the ships charge forward and board the enemy, cut off their heads, and then bring those aboard, but not burn the enemy ships. As the ships pulled up next to each other, Ikibe Sadamasa jumped onto the nearby Korean ship and shouted loudly that he was the first to board. The man was so busy boasting aloud that the Koreans on board ran him through with their spears. Now, even though he died, Tachibana Muneshige's other retainers boarded several Joseon ships and even captured a few. Takahashi Munemasa, his younger brother, had a fleet of his own, and they too boarded Joseon ships. They then cut the heads off their enemy and used the hair to tie them to their ship's railing. The other Japanese ships saw this and they cheered in victory. Shimazu Yoshihiro wasn't as alert as his comrade Tachibana though, so when the Joseon ships appeared, it caught him completely off guard. One of the Shimazu commanders, Kawakami Hisetatsu, sent his ship ahead to attack and board a nearby Joseon ship. There was a major problem though. The Joseon Panoksun was much larger, and the Japanese struggled to climb it. On top of that, arrows, matchlock shot, and even rocks rained down on them. One of these rocks hit Kawakami Hisetatsu in the head as he was fighting off the Joseon with a spear. It sent him to the deck, unconscious. The Joseon then threw hooks onto the Japanese ship so that it couldn't escape. On the same ship though was his 18-year-old son, Kawakami Hisekune, who then bravely climbed onto the Joseon ship and managed to cut down 17 soldiers to keep them away from his unconscious father. Then another Shimazu ship pulled up, and they were finally able to get free of the Korean ship. But just as the Shimazu ship started to pull away, another was hooked in. The Joseon soldiers threw barrels of gunpowder and flames onto the Japanese ship's deck, setting it ablaze. 54 Japanese sailors are said to have died on that ship. Yi Sun-sin, in the meantime, had been commanding from the front, and while this was incredibly brave, it also made him a target. The Japanese ships raced forward to surround his flagship, and desperate fighting ensued. The Ming naval commander, Chen Lin, arrived just a little later and saw his ally surrounded. He couldn't let Yi Sun-sin die, so he commanded his ships forward to save the Joseon. This caused the Japanese to then target him instead, and they surrounded his flagship. 2 Japanese soldiers snuck onto his ship in the dark and raced forward to kill him. Chen Lin's son was on board, and he threw himself to block the entrance of the bridge. And he was stabbed with a spear. One of the other officers ran forward with a dangpa to prevent the Japanese from finishing him off and managed to push them overboard. Chen Lin and his crew didn't seem like they could shake the Japanese, so he ordered his ship to stop. He then had two of his commanders, Wang Yuanzhao and Fu Risheng, to take command of two larger Joseon Panoxin to guard his flank. Chen Lin then gave the order for his men on the deck to fire their arrows and matchlocks that they had at the Japanese. This was expected to scare them off. It did the opposite. Instead, the Japanese leveled their own firearms and returned fire. This forced the Ming to lay down on the decks and use their shields to protect themselves. A few Japanese troops would then try and board, but they were pushed back with spears. Yi Sun-sin's ships now went forward, firing cannons everywhere that they went, sinking several ships. Yi's flagship took the lead, a brave action that would cost him his life. A few matchlock men had been hiding at the stern of their ship, and as his ship passed it, they shot him, ending the life of Korea's most famous naval commanders, a man that objectively could be said to have saved his people. Now, there's two different versions of his death. One has him dying instantly. The other one, that's become common in pop history, is that he, as he was dying, told his son, nephew, and commander Song Hui-rip, "We are about to win the war. Keep beating the drums. Do not announce my death." Now, regardless if this is true or not, they did try to hide his death, but it didn't work. The crew noticed that his nephew, Yi Wan, was in his uncle's armor and that it was covered in blood. They panicked and cried loudly that their commander was dead. Something that the other ships around them started to notice, and they too fell into panic. Tachibana's fleet, like a shark in the water, smelled blood, and they slammed their ship into Joseon ships that they could sink their hooks into. And it's estimated that these boarding attacks killed over 60 Joseon officers, as well as high-ranking ones like Yi Yong-nam. One can only guess how many regular soldiers were killed. It was at this moment that a Ming warship under the command of Shen Li came into view. All the cannons, firearms, and arrows released into the Japanese ships. Another Ming commander, Ji Jin, and more ships appeared, and they too fired their weapons. 130 Japanese soldiers were then beheaded by the Ming. As the sun started to creep over the horizon, around 6 a.m., Ming Commander Deng Zilong's ship raced forward to save Chen Lin and his men, who were still surrounded. Deng Zilong ordered his men to fire the Japanese ships as they passed. Chen Lin saw this and ordered his men to do the same. They did this with flamethrowers made from hollow bamboo tubes called Tong. Many Japanese ships caught fire from these, and to make matters worse for them, even more Ming ships started to pour in. Deng Zilong and his crew of about 200 took the lead at the front, killing and destroying everything in their path. His ship, though, was hit by friendly fire and started to burn. Japanese soldiers in a nearby ship took advantage of this and boarded them, slaughtering everyone on board. It's suggested that these may have been Tachibana Munishige's men. Now, without a hope of overcoming the overwhelming odds, and many of their ships burning, the Japanese turned their ships and tried to make a break for it. Tachibana's fleet was a lot smaller, so they would be able to retreat successfully. They even kept some of the ships that they had captured. Shimazu Yoshihiro wasn't as fortunate. The tides were starting to fall, which meant that while smaller ships could sail easily through the strait, larger ships struggled to do so. Large ships like Yoshihiro's flagship, which started to lag behind the rest of the fleet. The Ming and Joseon ships caught up to it soon enough and started to throw hooks into it so that they couldn't escape. They then surrounded and boarded the vessel. The Shimazu men fought desperately for their lives. Shimazu Yoshihiro's personal guards grabbed tate shields to form a barricade around them to protect them from the flying arrows. Then took their matchlocks and fired into the mass of the Ming and Joseon troops. While the fighting was going on, some of the enemy soldiers managed to steal Shimazu Yoshihiro's personal battle standard and took it onto their own ship. This was humiliating for the daimyo. A samurai named Kuroda Takuyamon saw this and couldn't bear to see his lord shamed like this, so he managed to board the enemy ship and take it back. Meanwhile, behind the shields, the Shimazu vassals Tanegashima Hisetoki and Kawakame expertly shot down many soldiers. This forced the enemy back into their own ships, where they hid in their cabins, with only their hands exposed, still pulling on the hooks, keeping the ship from escaping. The Japanese gunners shot at the exposed hands and threw torches at them as well. Eventually, the enemy finally released them, setting the ship free. But they weren't safe yet. They were still surrounded. Then, in what can only be described as courageous, the Shimazu vassal, Machida Hisama, and his men latched onto some of the enemy vessels and then forced themselves onto the ships, fighting to the last man. This allowed Yoshihiro the chance to escape, and I wonder what he was thinking in that moment, watching as maybe perhaps 30 men bravely give up their lives for your own. Shimazu Tadatsune, Yoshihiro's son, that hadn't gone with him due to feeling sick and was still on the island, didn't immediately know what had been happening. However, he did hear a frightening sound in the distance. Cannon fire. At dawn, around 6 a.m., Tadatsune left the island with his men in the Sekibune to investigate. As his ship got closer to Namhai-do, the sounds of the cannons stopped. Thick smoke from burning ships blanketed the waves. He motioned to his men to keep sailing. And then a Japanese ship was seen. The vessel was captained by the Shimazu retainer Ijiri Yagosuke, who then told them of the terrible defeat and that the Shimazu flagship had survived but was currently trapped and couldn't escape. Tadatsune urged his men to sail the ship as fast as they could, and as they did, they saw his father's ship. They could also see Tachibana Munashige's ships in the distance still. He then rushed forward to attack the enemy in an attempt to cover their retreat. He was successful, which allowed his father's flagship and the Tachibana fleet enough time to retreat. Konishi Yukinaga, while all this had happened, had left his fortress and escaped to Japan, using the Shimazu and Tachibana as a distraction. Yoshihiro would hear about this later. This both hurt and angered him. The end.